Mientras tanto, les doy la más cordial bienvenida a nuestro Masterclass del día de hoy, Tokenization Expands Opportunities for Entrepreneurs. We're pretty excited to have John here with us. This is a joint kind of venture between the Cornell Club in Mexico and Anáhuac University. We're really glad to have with us Juan de Dios Garza, Maestro Juan de Dios Garza. He is the president of the Cornell Club in Mexico. And we also have another Cornell fellow, Laura Iturbide. She's the director at the Instituto de Desarrollo Empresarial Anáhuac of the Anáhuac University in Mexico. For the initial remarks, I wanted to introduce you, Juan de Dios Garza. Juan de Dios, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ana Paula. Nice to see you, everybody. This is a pleasure to have John Woo with us and all of you to come to this seminar. I want to introduce to John Woo with some of the main issues of his life that probably can give you a better idea who is John Woo. John Woo is an economist from Cornell University, an MBA from Harvard University. He founded Sorbio with the strategic investment from Blackstone and was previously a technological investor in Kingdom Capital and Tiger Management. As a seasoned tech entrepreneur, John also held a position of CEO of SharePost's Digital Assets Group, where he built and managed the digital asset business, which ran the first ever digital custody operation. That is amazing. Since early 2020, he has served as a president of ABA Labs, a spin-off from Cornell University that builds the Internet of Finance. That is amazing. John. Thank you for coming with us, and I'm going to give you the opportunity to tell us something else that you want to tell before you start, and then when you decide, we can start.
Well, thank you so much for the kind intro, Juan, and thank you for co-hosting with the Cornell Club of Mexico. And I also want to thank Anáhuac University for co-hosting with the help of Ana and Laura for helping put this together. I'm very excited to be here and to speak with everyone and share with you some of the exciting opportunities that I see in the world of blockchain, fintech, and tokenization, as well as the entire entrepreneurial and VC landscape in Mexico and Latin America. As Juan said, I'm John Woo, and he went through my background already, so we'll continue and skip this slide. But the agenda today is to talk about things. For some of you, I know the backgrounds here are very different, from very sophisticated in the world of blockchain to very sophisticated in fintech. But I thought at least I would introduce what blockchain was, at least how we defined it, and what tokenization is. And then I would love to move on to venture capital in Latin America, because venture capital in Latin America is growing quite quickly. And the ramifications for that would lead to various entrepreneurial opportunities in Mexico. From my understanding, a lot of people in the audience are looking for entrepreneurial opportunities, and I'd love to share with some of you some of the great sectors and verticals that are providing some great opportunities for entrepreneurs. And then specifically, I want to talk about the digitization of assets and tokenization on the blockchain, and how Ava Labs, the company that I'm president of, can help in that process. And then finally, I will conclude with some summary remarks and then open it up for Q&A. So without further ado, what is blockchain? Well, blockchain is actually very simple. It is a shared database distributed ledger. You know, the blockchain technology records transactions between multiple parties on a shared ledger that is verified and immutable. And what makes that possible is the consensus protocols. These are algorithms that allow the computers on the network to agree on which data should be stored on the blockchain cryptographically. And when Vitalik Buterin introduced Ethereum, he introduced a whole new concept, the concept of applications being built on the blockchain. Smart contracts. Smart contracts are one type of application that can be built on the blockchain. Smart contracts are programmable. They enable the creation of programmable assets and with an automated workflow. So a lot of you are probably familiar with the blockchain called Bitcoin, and Bitcoin doesn't have this flexibility. So it's harder to program on that blockchain. But Ethereum and Vitalik Buterin and the founders of Ethereum purposely created something so you can program on top of it and create applications. And what I want to talk about is how blockchain enables what I think will be a new era of financial products and services with what we call programmable money. This is what will allow people to create new types of businesses in fintech and financial services. Now, what is programmable money? Some of you may already know what a digital dollar is or digital peso is. And if you come to the US, you may even think, wait, there is no such thing as cash anymore. No one carries cash in their wallets. Everything is digital. I can send my money to someone else either using Venmo, PayPal, or various digital payment mechanisms. My account and my bank, I can just check my balances very easily. Nothing is really cash or paper anymore. So what's the difference between digital money and tokenized money? Well, digital money is very simple representation of ownership. All we're doing is taking traditional ways of ownership of assets and money and putting it digitally zeros and ones into a what I call a centralized or silo databases controlled by major banks. Now, there's a lot of compliance these banks provide. These are trust centers, and they provide enforcement and a lot of payments. So fast forward, that's how the world has been working for about 30, 40 years. And then fast forward into the late 2000s, early 2010s, and the concept of blockchain and smart contracts evolved. What that has done is turn digital money into what I call tokenized money. Now you can embed that compliance, that enforcement, and the rules and restrictions on how to transfer assets or money in a programmable code manner. So smart contracts, in some sense, or blockchains enable smart contracts to program conditions into an asset. Now you have programmable ownership, stored on an interoperable network, no longer that centralized database at one bank. In effect, it becomes trustless. Instead of trusting JP Morgan, you trust the code. And the programmable compliance and enforcement of the payments comes from the code as opposed to the bank or regulatory bodies. So that's the intro into blockchain, tokenization, smart contracts, and programmable money. Now I'd like to take the conversation to a more meta macro level and talk about venture capital in all of Latin America. So if you notice here, look at the bars on the right in 2019. What is astonishing here is that venture investment in Latin America has grown by leaps and bounds, more than doubled in terms of dollars every year from 2016 to 2019. In fact, if you go all the way back to 2011, $146 million only was invested in the space. Today, $4.6 billion in 2019 was invested in venture in Latin America. Latin America is growing leaps and bounds in venture investment. This is great for potential entrepreneurs. Now, to highlight some of the points of the venture investing in 2019, over $1 billion were raised by VC funds. And in that same year, VCs invested over $4.6 billion into the various parts of Latin America startups. And what's even better is that they now have what we call mega rounds. 18 investments were over $50 million each, and 11 transactions were over $100 million investments. So in the US, we have this thing called the unicorn, and estimates are there are about 350 to 400 unicorns in the US, and there's close to 200 unicorns in China. And in 2019, in Latin America, we finally started seeing the unicorn. You had, at least from our analysis, at least 5, maybe 6 unicorns already pop up. That's a great start. And it just shows you where it potentially can be. The US was at 4 or 5 unicorns circa 2010. And it's grown from 4 or 5 to 300, 400. So in the same time period, I can see the same thing happening in Latin America. So not just big transactions. More importantly, for a lot of people on this call, you're going to have a record year in early stage investing. So for seed and incubator transactions, lower, smaller tickets to get new companies started, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina set records for dollars allocated for early stage investing. So if we break the numbers down further, you'll see 2 big important things on this. Brazil had about, in 2019, $2.49 billion invested in venture. That's a little more than half of all the venture money. The second thing that catches your eye, if you look at the top of the screen, Mexico. In 2019, $649 million was invested in over 100 deals. Now, if you look at 2018, Mexico had about 175 million invested. So although Brazil is bigger in absolute dollars invested, Mexico by far is the fastest growing. In 1 year, investment in startups and in venture almost quadrupled. That's a great growth rate. So we've talked about how the venture environment is growing like crazy. Where is the opportunity for the individual entrepreneur in Mexico then? And from our analysis, that venture money is flowing more and more into the area of fintech. And there are a couple of reasons why fintech has been able to grow so quickly. One, if you look at the current population, only about 25% of the population in Mexico, as an example, has a credit card. If you look at India today, only about 6% of the population is using a credit card, but about 35% of the population is transacting in a credit or in a payment fashion through apps on their phones. So that's unbelievable how fintech can actually surpass old technologies like credit cards. And that's what I can probably see in a lot of Latin America as well. You know, another reason why fintech is being allocated so much money to solve problems is because historically in Latin America, the currency and the inflation areas have been very volatile. So we've had high inflation and currency devaluation. That has not happened in Mexico for some time, so that's fantastic. However, in other parts like Venezuela and other parts of Latin America, it's actually happened very recently. And then one of the biggest points here, the bottom right, low banking penetration. So if you look at in the US, only 7% of the population is unbanked. In China currently, 15% is unbanked. Whereas in Mexico, about 32% is unbanked. Now, an important thing to point out here is China, about, call it 8-9 years ago, was also about 30%. So in 7 to 8 years, they've cut that down in half. And that's probably the similar trajectory we can see in Mexico as well as the rest of Latin America. These numbers are from 2017, so they're a little bit dated, but it gives you the point, and it's from the World Bank. So to further highlight the fintech aspect of venture in Mexico and all of Latam, I think the scene is very ripe for opportunity. I mean, so far in 2019 and 20, we've had over 280 fintech firms in Mexico. 100 of these were established in 2018, so that's over 50% growth. And then the dollar amount of 303 so far in 2020 represents 130% dollars committed to the fintech venture landscape. And if you look at the entire pie of that venture capital dollars that we talked about earlier, about a third of all Latin American investments are in the fintech industry. So once again, this highlights that this is one of the fastest growing areas in a fast growing venture environment for Mexico and Latin America. There's a reason why fintech is also growing so fast from a regulatory perspective. And I think Mexico was very smart. It was one of the first Latin American countries to establish guidelines and regulations of the fintech sector via the 2018 fintech law. We've seen other countries do this. Singapore has done this. So has China have regulation to help promote growth. And it's brilliant because it allows companies, in Mexico's case, a 2-year waiving of traditional licenses in their sandbox experiment so that you don't need the same compliance for regulatory requirements that other places do, in other countries do in Latin America. So that allows you to innovate with new technology, allows you to experiment. And it's not like it's untethered and unfeathered experimentation, because they do have compliance. You know, there's still disclosure requirements, there's minimal capital required, and there's also restrictions on how wealth can be transferred into non-Mexican institutions. But reality is, if you have this 2-year temporary license suspension with certain guidelines, you will promote growth in the fintech world. You'll, by maintaining market integrity, protecting customers, as well as a more financially inclusive end result as more technology comes in Mexico. So here are some examples. Like we said already, the fintech sector has been dominated by startups focused on payments, loans, and lending. Clip, a digital payment startup, recently received a $20 million investment from SoftBank. Credit Justo, a lending startup, raised $42 million from Goldman Sachs in the US and 0.72. Klar is a mobile payment startup that raised close to $58 million in debt and equity seed funding. That's a large seed ticket. This was the largest ever in the history of Mexico. And then Confio received, they do payment loan, it's a payment loan startup. They basically received $100 million of credit from Goldman Sachs. So the thing I want to point out here is these traditional fintech companies are raising a lot of money, and they are raising it from traditional sources. The crypto landscape, from our analysis inside of fintech, only accounts for 10% of Mexico's fintech funding. I think there's a great opportunity for Mexican entrepreneurs in the crypto blockchain space to take further share in a very fast-growing fintech environment, in a fast-growing venture environment for entrepreneurs in all of Mexico and Latin America. So you've got, in my opinion, it will be the crypto and blockchain fintech disruptors will be one of the fastest growth areas in the fastest sector of venture fintech in a very fast-growing macro venture environment. So now I want to talk about taking the conversation back to the original tokenizing assets and financial services and why I think they have a competitive advantage over traditional fintech as well as traditional services. Well, we talked about it slightly already. I used the example of India, where 6% of the population is banked in a traditional manner, and yet 30% of them have apps where they can transfer payments and effectively provide what they call neobank functionality. Same thing happened in China, where Alibaba's Ant Financials took advantage of the fact that there was very few traditional banking services provided for a vast majority of population. So they disrupted it by creating massive wallets and growth, providing, again, financial services for a lot of Chinese people that were unbanked. So fintech around the world has been able to grow faster than traditional banking services because they make things easier and they make things more efficient. Some examples of this we talked about already, such as payments. In payments, there's been remittance where if you use a traditional Western Union, sometimes you're giving up 10 to 15% of your money to move money back and forth. And yet, if you use a crypto solution, it is basis points. You save tremendous amount of money. Money exchange rails. What I mean by that is cross-border exchanges. So if you look at companies like Ripple, Ripple has estimated that the world today in cross-border exchange of money, there's roughly about $190 trillion of money that move across borders every single year. Using what the XRP, which is what crypto uses, Ripple uses their crypto or blockchain solution, they estimate that they can cut out $1.9 trillion, 1% of the $190 trillion of cross-border activity. They can save the world $1.9 trillion. That's pretty good. Now, other areas where tokenizing assets and blockchain can help are digital assets. And I'm going to get into one particular area of digital assets shortly, the fund management aspect of it, where we at Ava Labs, using our Avalanche protocol, is helping save money and create new assets and digitizing new assets in creative ways. Before I do that, I do also want to mention in areas of financial services, such as like DeFi, which is decentralized finance on the blockchain. Literally, there are brilliant young engineers and business entrepreneurs coming together to create and replicate existing financial products in lending, as well as derivative products that exist in traditional financial markets, and creating it on blockchains and saving, again, lots of costs by cutting out intermediaries and making the workflow far efficient, and also creating new revenue models that people never thought of. So here are some other verticals where streamlining business processes by adopting blockchain is happening. We talked about lending, fund management, real estate. There are plenty of companies out there trying to tokenize and fractionalize real estate ownership. Imagine if you can own just one apartment in a giant building. Right now, in the US at least, that's very hard. If you want to own a building, you are either a large developer or a large company that owns many buildings. But the power of blockchain and fractionalizing, because you can transfer rights of ownership easily into a shared database, allows you to fractionalize that ownership as well and create far more owners in that one building as opposed to the way it's done now. Payments, we talked about that. There are plenty of blockchain companies in supply chain, trade finance, intellectual property, royalty rights, and digital identity. Those are in different colors because they're not necessarily fintech. And but I wanted to mention that blockchain is not just about fintech, even though I think it's very helpful for financial technology. So I wanted to talk about a very specific use case here for streamlining fund management. As we talked about before, digital assets can be programmed to have automated ownership, payments, and compliance conditions. So right now, one of the very interesting use cases is creating funds where the ownership is digitized and transferred on to a blockchain. But it makes it so much easier, especially if it's a debt product. Think about it. Bond payments, coupon payments, or dividend distributions in an equity, or even fund distribution. Every time one of those activities happens, is a lot of middlemen and a lot of paperwork and a lot of workflow that needs to be done in order for it to happen. If everyone were on a shared database and things were programmed so the code enabled a lot of that automatically, you can easily see coupon payments coming into your wallet, your secure wallet, at a regular basis without any intermediaries like banks or other players that we have to have today. And most importantly, if done well, these transfer restrictions and investor account restrictions and flowback restrictions, they can all be programmed. The compliance can be programmed into the smart contract on the blockchain. Think about how you do business right now and imagine all the intermediaries that are there to help you do that. If suddenly we can remove most of them, That's how much money you can save, and that's how you can dream about this. So, and it's still nascent because a lot of fund managers today who use blockchain to enable their business, they're only using it to issue and to trade. So they tokenize the right of ownership of an asset, whether it's a fund or a security, and they use that to help raise money. And then those ownership units, those LPs or partnership units, get represented on a chain, a blockchain, as a token, and then it's distributed appropriately. Obviously, they put in the restrictions, lockups, redemption windows, and everything is programmed. And then ultimately, what they hope is that that allows for potential buyers to access secondary markets, more liquidity, where other whitelisted eligible investors can pass through KYC, ML, accreditation checks, and then suddenly take that real estate example, where in the old days, you buy a piece of real estate, if you can even get your hands on it, and it sits there for years and years and years. Suddenly, because many people own each apartment in that real estate building, you can actually transfer your little piece or your apartment to someone else when you need liquidity. That was not possible before blockchain and fractionalization. So here's another example to talk, the third-party service providers that are required to make a fund manager and his product happen. You have literally 8 to 9 constituents. You have the fund manager, the bank, the custody provider, fund administrator, fund valuation company, accounting and auditing firms. Obviously, you have governance and compliance from regulatory bodies. And then you have the exchange that allows you to transfer all of this. Each one of these constituents, there are many companies, and each one of these companies has their own silo database. And the arrows here are to represent how complicated it is for one of these constituents to actually access the databases of everyone else's. You have to have your own developers, you have to create APIs, and you have to create APIs to let other people into it, and you have to make sure that you have the right security and you protect the data that you don't want to share with other people. That's how the world works today. Very messy. And to accomplish all this, third-party providers have inserted themselves into the process so that they can perform that functionality for the bank or the fund administrator. So in other words, you have many parties, a very messy process, and third parties have been created in order to provide a seamless process. So you pay money for those third-party service providers to do the work of those arrows that we talked about. If you move this process onto Avalanche or a blockchain, everyone is on an interoperable ecosystem, allowing all the fund managers, all the compliance people, all the bank to connect with third parties instantly on one platform in a secure way. And all of the requirements and the restrictions, instead of having individual APIs for each one of these constituents, they can be programmed onto the network or the smart contract with it, as we talked about, the programmable asset, so that it is far easier and far simpler. You get rid of the third party, and you also incentivize the existing players in this to work together because they all save a lot of money. This is what it could possibly look like. A flexible architecture will allow funds and service providers all to connect together in a shared, secure database of a blockchain. And a lot of the functionality, instead of paperwork and manual movement, is now programmable. Now, a lot of you may know the company Mercado Libre. They don't use a blockchain, but they've kind of replicated using old technology, this ecosystem methodology, where you have the merchants, you have banks, you have the purchasers, and you have third-party providers all sitting in one ecosystem, and a network effect happens, making Mercado Libre one of the largest and best e-commerce and payment companies in Latin America. Very similar to the way Alibaba and Ant Financial are in China. So another quick example, and I know we're going to run out a little bit of time, so I'm going to go faster with this, is there's a thing called HELOC in the US, home equity loans. There's a company called Figure, and they've optimized several processes, and they've actually raised over $1 billion in loans on their blockchain. And that ownership and the rights of people and the loans and the payments are all already optimized in programmable code, so things just happen in your account as opposed to having to send things around. They've already reported that out of this $1 billion, they've saved 130 basis points of cost savings. That's a decent amount when the numbers start getting bigger and bigger in origination, in savings in origination, financing, and securitization. I'm not going to go through exactly how it works because we're going to run out of time, but we can do that in another session if people are interested. But what I want to get to is that Avalanche can enable blockchain entrepreneurs in fintech. This is what Avalanche is built for. We have the technology. We have grants as well for people who can propose great projects to help them get started and create opportunity in digital financial services and provide and take advantage of the flexibility in the Mexican regulatory frameworks. So afterwards, Ricardo on this call or myself would be happy to talk to any creative developers or business people who want to talk more about how they can get grants and proposals, grants with their proposals from Avalanche, and hopefully create a fantastic blockchain-enabled fintech startup. Now, I also want to end on one slide to show that why crypto and blockchains is going to be a very fast-growing area inside of fintech. If you look at the world and this is a survey that was done, if you look at the world, what percentage of the country's population have actually used or own cryptocurrencies, you'll see actually in the US with all this development and all this venture, according to this survey, only 5% of the US population has used or owned cryptocurrencies who sit on blockchains. Whereas if you look at Mexico here, 12%. So there, I would argue in Mexico and lots of places in Latin America, Brazil, 18%, Colombia, 18%, Argentina, 16%, Chile, 11%. There is already a lot of blockchain and crypto awareness. And as the money flows from the VCs to the fintech to crypto / blockchain enabled fintech companies, it will be a far easier path to getting to a startup if you're an entrepreneur than just trying to start up something in a different sector. With that, I'd like to bring the call back to the host for a possible Q&A.
Jan, thank you so much for your lecture. I think that everyone, as I have, are really excited about all of these and in your perspective for the crypto space in LATAM. For the Q&A session, I would like to introduce you all Ricardo. Ricardo is the business development at Latin America for Ava Labs, which we thank a lot because he facilitated this masterclass. So Ricardo and I will be leading the questions. Ricardo, do you want to start with the first one?
Sure, thank you. So John, we have one question that I think it's very important. And it says, it's about how is blockchain, what I would say crypto ecosystem, but the question is blockchain ecosystem is affected by the fact that over 95% of all crypto assets are owned by less than 1% of the users. And I think that the Miguel Raz, who asked it, has these statistics, and I would like to know your position, and that I'm sure is very interesting.
So Miguel's contention is that 95% of the crypto assets are owned by 1% of the users?
That's the question, right? I mean,
what he's asking about is the heavy concentration in ownership of blockchain and crypto. So, you know, I don't think, I won't dispute the number of 95%. I've heard numbers that are far lower. If you look at the different blockchains, you can see where money has been deposited, so to speak. I think the number is lower, but the point is taken. There's a lot of centralization right now, at least in money, in Bitcoin at least, and somewhat in Ethereum. Now, that money has actually not moved around that much. So the good news is, even though it may be sitting somewhere in someone's locked up wallet, if you will, or ledger, or on somewhere, it hasn't been circulated. So whoever is holding on to it has not been releasing it. I think the point here, though, is the money itself associated with these blockchains is not the full story. The full story is blockchain technology is growing very, very quickly. A lot of the examples I gave today, the fund management, that's a private blockchain. You can create either a private blockchain or you can create a public blockchain. In a private blockchain, you have companies like major banks like JP Morgan have massive efforts in creating private blockchains, their own network. Just like that chart I showed you where there's 9 constituents that make a fund work. There are 9 constituents inside of JP Morgan that they need to talk together in a secure, fast way to make some sort of business process work. So the cryptocurrencies is just part of that in the permissionless world, but blockchain and entrepreneurialism for different products and fintech-like products is far more than just those permissionless blockchains. And it's not clear to me that the locked up heavy concentration that Miguel was referring to is going to stifle development in entrepreneurialism, because the numbers don't show it. The numbers show great VC activity, lots of fundraising, and then blockchain related fintech projects are gaining share on other areas of fintech.
Thank you, John. For the following question, we have Alejandra Pacheco asking us, which challenges and opportunities do you identify to adopt and use tokens in Latin America, considering there is a low rate of financial inclusion?
I think that is the very point. Because there's such low rate of financial inclusion, I go back to the Indian example. You know, over 1 billion people in India, only 6% are banked. So they are even more excluded than other places in Latin America. But yet somehow they've achieved 30% of the population owning some sort of wallet in terms of a traditional wallet where they can move money around like Venmo or PayPal, something to that nature. So the whole point is this is a technology that is disruptive and creates more inclusion. I would liken it to how mobile came about. And you can look at India, and again, you can look at China. I mean, mobile handsets really came about in the late 90s, early 2000s, where the penetration of landline phone service in China was actually very low compared to the rest of the world at the time in the early 90s. But somehow by the late 90s and mid 2000s, cell phones were far more penetrated in China and Korea than it was in the US. So the point is, these new technologies and new ways of doing things is a great opportunity to create inclusion and to end around the old ways of doing things that are actually exclusionary.
Okay, we have another question from Carlos Rodrigo. I don't know if he's from Mexico, but the question is, from your experience, what do you think should be the process to educate about blockchain in a country that lacks regulatory aspects in this matter? Technological backward and high index of ignorance and lack of education. I repeat, I don't know if he's from Mexico, but for sure, John, you have also, he's from Bolivia.
Okay. So I have to admit, I don't know the specific dynamics of the Bolivian country, but the underlying question, I think, is how will blockchain innovation happen in a country that there is relatively low education, lack of inclusion, and I guess a lack of technology penetration? I think, is that right to summarize part of what he said, Ricardo?
Yeah, exactly. I think that broadly speaking, we have a challenge in Latin America with the lack of education. For example, something very basic like Ponzi schemes, and also with the lack of education in innovation and technology. So what's your perspective to educate the ecosystem in blockchain and crypto?
Right. So I think those are definitely challenges. And I think embedded in that question is, how do you avoid scams for a country that may not be as up to speed on what happens in a lot of crypto world? You know, there was over 2,000 cryptocurrencies developed in about 2017. And frankly, a lot of them were scams in some sense or another, either in the legal sense or in the business sense of some Ponzi scheme. And that is definitely a problem. However, if you go back to that last chart that I show, surprisingly, some of the countries that have the most usage are countries that arguably have less education and less technology. And there's a reason for that. There are certain parts of the cryptocurrency world that the technology can be built relatively easily and put on a phone. And there are certain applications that have really penetrated the country's population. You know, it's not on this chart, but for instance, the Philippines, there's a big remittance business in the US for Filipinos who come to the US, work here, and send money back to their families in the Philippines. And that population has somehow learned to use cryptocurrency as a way to remit money back to their own family, because they were using Western Union, paying sometimes 10, 12% of the hard-earned dollars they had here. And naturally, they figured out a way, and then the word got around, and suddenly they were using cryptocurrencies and paying literally basis points to remit money back to their native country. So it's logical what the gentleman said from Bolivia, but again, the numbers actually show something very interesting, is that even if a country is not as well educated or technology savvy, the penetration in crypto use has actually been higher than, say, a US, where only 5% of the country has used or owned cryptocurrencies.
Oh, thank you, John. We have another question here from Claudio Martinez. He's asking us, well, you, on your website, you talk about the energy efficiency of your solution compared to Bitcoin or their solutions. Could you expand on that?
Sure. So Bitcoin is a proof of work, and it's a system where you have to have people on these nodes, or these miners as they call it. And what these miners do basically is they solve math problems to validate that the transaction is real. They added a separate component in Bitcoin where the person who solves it the fastest gets to validate that and earn 50 Bitcoin every time they are the first ones. So it became a game in Bitcoin for the people who can actually have the fastest processing power. In order to have processing power, you needed the right servers or the right GPUs and the right machines, and you needed access to cheap power. Ultimately, the number one variable was cheap power. So it became very concentrated in certain areas. 60% of the mine coin come from China because they had access to cheap power. It's changing now with hydro and solar and wind, but yet even with cheaper power, in order to validate and add a new block in Bitcoin, it's been estimated that it would cost, roughly the GDP of certain countries in terms of energy spent a year in order to validate and add to blocks, especially as Bitcoin gets bigger and bigger. That's what they mean by there's a lot of energy wasted when in the Bitcoin model. Since then, people like us, Avalanche, has created consensus protocols, not through a mining, but more of a proof of stake, more software-based, easier, where you actually use your coins and you establish your right to validate effectively by having your coins instead of having to create the coins through energy. So that's why the proof of stake way of validating a transaction is actually more efficient. It all ends up going back to proving something happens and how you have to prove that. Bitcoin by design wanted to tether itself to some sort of real world functionality in order to make it so there were some barriers so not everyone can just become a validator. Whereas proof of stake, again, they embedded it, some of the functionality into the software code itself. So you don't need to have massive mining rigs, and you don't have to get access to hydroelectric power in order to be to win that validation.
Thank you. Next question is from Eric Jael. That it says, what's your opinion about these fintech topics and blockchain topics and the relationship with universities? It's something that must be taught in universities?
So it depends on what aspect. I think in business programs, there's a lot of teaching of fintech. I don't think there's a lot of teaching of blockchain yet, but in the computer science part of universities, there's definitely far more teaching of distributed systems, and blockchain is a subsector, if you will, or a subtopic of distributed systems and network engineering. So if you go to the computer science department, there's far more teaching in blockchain. And if you go to the business department, there's far more teaching in fintech, because fintech is really more finance first, technology second. The fintech creating blockchain is technology first and maybe finance second.
Thank you, John. We have several questions about regulation. So how do you see regulation worldwide, and how do you think it will affect or help the crypto ecosystem?
Regulation is a very tough and tricky subject because it's different in every single country. A lot of countries or a lot of companies that have raised money or have created digitization of assets and need to treat it as a security, some have defaulted to using the US regulatory rules because those are universally known as probably the toughest. Others have not. And I think the problem with the US, frankly, is there's a lot of innovation, but the rules are so tough. It gives other countries with, call it more relaxed rules, a chance to innovate faster in this case. And this is why, going back to this slide, I think Mexico has done an unbelievable, fantastic, and brilliant job of creating the 2018 FinTech law, where they give entrepreneurs a 2-year basically reprieve from the traditional licenses they would need to create and innovate in their sandbox, part of their FinTech law process. So if you take a lot of the requirements from a very costly as well as a workflow and as well as a regulatory aspect away from it, you will promote far more growth. So I think, unfortunately for the US, because rules are so restrictive, a lot of blockchain companies and a lot of innovation will happen outside of the US. And I hope that's not the case because I'm American, but it's great for Mexico and great for places where they have actually established specific laws like the 2018 FinTech law and created a sandbox for these entrepreneurs. So again, if you're an entrepreneur on this call, take advantage of what this law is providing. Take advantage of the access to capital that the venture community in Latin America is providing right now.
And very related with your answer is the next question from Rene Colorado. And he asks, as an investor, what do you suggest to start to take the opportunities that the Mexican market is offering? I think it's related with your previous answer.
So I think is the question, if you look at things from an investor's perspective as opposed to an entrepreneur's perspective, where would I be putting money? Is that the question?
Yeah, I think so.
So if I were a venture capitalist and I'm allocating capital, I think Latin American venture capitalists, or in this case, even non Latin American venture capitalists, they are putting money, and I agree with this, they are putting money into fintech because they're just the right rules and regulations, the right amount of people underbanked who need services, and the existing infrastructure doesn't provide for it. So if you look at these great Latin America fintech companies, Clip, Credit Justo, Claire, Confio, and then you look at the names associated with the funding. Japan's SoftBank gave 20 million to Clip. Credit Justo, Goldman Sachs, a US bank, and Point72, a US venture firm. And then Confio, again, credit from Goldman Sachs. So if I am an American, and I'm running a venture capital firm, I would be following Goldman Sachs and Point72 and investing in some great fintech, hopefully blockchain-enabled fintech companies in Latin America.
And for the last question, we have Francisco Barajas asking you, what are the risks of using blockchain cryptocurrencies in terms of cybersecurity, knowing that cyber attacks are more and more every day? And number two, what are your recommendations to mitigate those risks?
So let's talk about this in two perspectives, one from Bitcoin and then one from the other currencies that are out there. So whether it's Bitcoin or other currencies, frankly, so far a lot of the hacks or the issues associated with cryptocurrencies have not been at the underlying blockchain code level. If you go back to Bitcoin, the Mt. Gox hack in 2014 and other hacks since then, this happened at what I call the human touch level. It was the exchange, the Mt. Gox exchange, that had bad human processes or had insiders inside of Mt. Gox effectively hack and break through to that and then steal about $400 million and caused a crash in 2014 for Bitcoin. If you look at Ethereum and DAO situation in 2017, I think it was, again, a flawed concept and was not necessarily someone broke the Ethereum blockchain down. So luckily, the issue in cybersecurity for blockchain and crypto hasn't been the Bitcoin blockchain itself. It has been the things around the blockchain itself. So the unfortunate thing is, the reality is cybersecurity is very important. And if we look at the things that's happened to crypto, you can easily see it happen also in other parts of technology. Just yesterday, there was a massive hack into Twitter. I don't know if you guys were following it. In the US, it was all over the news where there were hacks that got into Twitter accounts of Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and many, many other people, including Ava. Luckily, we reacted, Avalanche and Ava Labs, luckily we reacted very quickly and put the right processes in place to shut down the hacking. But it happened for Jeff Bezos on Twitter. So the kind of cybersecurity hacks that we just talked about, they're happening everywhere. It's not subject just to crypto or blockchain. The good news is the underlying code itself for the blockchain at Bitcoin and Ethereum, that itself has basically held up. The hacks have come outside of that, the human touch zones.
Great. I don't know, Ana Paula, if we have time for another one, or we give the microphones to Doctora Laura Iturbide.
It's unfortunately our time is over, so it's time for the closing remarks with Doctora Laura Iturbide. As I said before, she's the director at Instituto de Desarrollo Empresarial Anáhuac of Anáhuac University in Mexico. So, Doctora, please.
Thank you, John. I want to thank you not only as a Cornellian alumni, but also as the director of the NAWAC Institute for Business Development. There is no doubt that cryptocurrency and blockchain are changing entrepreneurship, but also the way we do business. Please, John, keep in touch with the Cornell community here in Mexico, and thank you again for your very enlightening participation. Thanks to Ricardo for making this possible, and also for the audience. And wait for us of our upcoming events. Thank you very much to you all.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. And I enjoyed it. And thank you again to the audience as well.
Thank you all,
Thank
and
you.
have a great evening.